It was one of the most audacious acts of terror the world had ever seen. They used 350 kilos of gelignite and TNT, and they planted the bomb in broad daylight in a building full of people. Nearly 60 years on, and it is as fresh in the memory as ever for those involved.
I was running as fast as I could, with the bomb on my shoulder. There were a lot of explosives inside. It was heavy.
The bomb killed 91 people and 45 others were injured. But little did the bombers of Jerusalem's King David Hotel back in 1946 know that they were one day to be hailed as the founding fathers of a new age of terror. For their success inspired waves of imitators around the world.
If my sacrifice for that is to be called a terrorist, then I'm glad to have been a terrorist for liberation.
We didn't mind being called terrorists then, because we actually used force, such force, a brutal force, in order to get rid of them.
We knew we only had one chance in 1,000 of coming out alive. The death was around every corner.
This is the story of the birth of modern terrorism, of the activists who invented it, and of how it has been appropriated and dispersed around the globe. Jerusalem, cradle of faith to Muslim, Jew, and Christian alike. Jerusalem, the birthplace of modern terrorism.
After a bomb explosion caused by terrorists on the British headquarters at Jerusalem, one entire corner of the King David Hotel, a building of 7 stories, was razed to the ground. The stone floors were cut clean.
In scenes eerily reminiscent of New York 55 years later, the Jerusalem bomb was the beginning of terrorism as a media event, designed to capture the world's attention.
The latest casualty list included 65 killed, 47 injured.
The perpetrators, Zionist Jews, members of Menachem Begin's Irgun terrorist network. Begin, who would one day become Prime Minister of Israel, described this tactic as turning Palestine into a glass house, where the entire world was looking in.
I think it was one of these acts of violence that, ahead of its time, I mean, in an era before CNN, before instantaneous news, was choreographed precisely to attract international attention.
We were a minority, but we were a minority with a clear ideology that we must have a Jewish state to rebuild the state which was existing many, many hundreds of years ago.
The bombing of the King David Hotel was perhaps one of the most significant terrorist incidents of the 20th century. For many decades, it actually held the infamous record of having killed the largest number of people.
In a fight for liberty, you have always those who are more, call them extreme, or more adamant, or call them staunch, and they want it immediately, not to wait for the Messiah.
Still lying under the shadow of terrorist attacks, many areas of Palestine are...
By the end of World War II, the British, who had been made responsible for looking after Palestine by the old League of Nations 27 years earlier, found it to be a serious headache. They were caught in the middle of the Arabs and the Jews, both of whom wanted the country for their own, were unwilling to peacefully coexist, and were agreed on only one thing: their hatred of the British, whom they both saw as foreign occupiers. The British military and administrative headquarters was here, in the south wing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. The luxury hotel itself still functioned with guests, restaurants, bars, and Sudanese waiters.
Jerusalem at that time, it was a fortress. And I walk through the town and put in my mind every place and think about how can we attack this place. If we succeed, it's very important the whole world will see that we can fight even the British.
Begin and Ellis decided on a daring plan. They would strike at the very heart of British rule, the King David Hotel itself. If they succeeded here, the whole world would take notice. The terrorist's bomb was hidden in 7 milk churns and delivered in a hijacked pickup truck to the hotel's basement kitchen.
We jumped out and everyone took up their positions. I took the churn and started to run. I was thinking, how do I get to the place where I have to put the churn down? That's how I started. Anyway, there were lots of people around in the corridor, and we tried to move them out of the way. Here, there, to the side. But there were some who resisted, but we threatened them with our weapons. I wasn't dressed as a civilian or a soldier. I was dressed like an Arab, with a jalaba and a keffiyeh, with that ring on your head. You know, like, what's he called? The leader of the Arabs. You know, Arafat. There were 7 churns, weighing 350 kilos in all. I ran until I reached the place where I had to put it down, with the churn on my shoulder. I carried on, until I got to the place where the British people were. I saw a pillar that used to be here, and I put the churn down and ran away immediately. I waited in my position until all the churns were together, and then the time would come for the explosion. All the churns together were like one whole man, a complete bomb.
The bomb went off at 12:37 and was devastating. But of the 91 dead, only 28 were British. 17 Jews died alongside 41 Arabs. Of all these, 54 were innocent civilians, unconnected to the British authorities in any way.
It's classic terror in that it's off the mainstream. It's not a reflection of the policies of the then Israeli leadership, which had a very strong ethical approach to the use of violence, admirable in many ways. And it shows too a sign of the future in that it's the damage being done by the splinter of the main movement, which is the damage we frequently call terrorist, and which is the most likely to be without any moral dimension.
Once more, the civilized world has received a rude shock at the hands of fanatics whose wanton act is contrary to the dictates of all creeds alike and imperils the best interests of the cause that it strives to promote.
The Irgun denied that they aimed at civilian targets, but one man at least had a different opinion. In 1948, the British Chief Secretary in Palestine, Sir Henry Gurney, wrote in his diary of how one Irgun attack was indiscriminately aimed at civilian targets and was designed to create panic among the population. 3 years later, Gurney himself was to be assassinated, as liberation movements all over the world took note of the flame that had been ignited in Palestine. By 1948, the British and the world community had lost their appetite for the fight against the Jewish terrorists, and the British abandoned Palestine, leaving Arab and Jew to fight it out amongst themselves. But elsewhere in their restless colonies, others had watched and learnt from the success of the Zionist terrorists. One, in Malaya, became the most wanted man in the British Empire. He was called Chin Peng, and the British labelled him a communist terrorist.
There he is, that's him. Chin Peng, director responsible for a brutal 7-year campaign of murder and terrorism against the ordinary people of Malaya.
Of course I am a terrorist. Because we thought we were just. We were fighting the oppressor, the foreign oppressor, the colonizer. We want to liberate our country.
No one embodied the image of foreign oppressor and colonizer more than the most important Englishman in the Far East, British High Commissioner Sir Henry Gurney, the very same man who, while in Palestine, had noted the use of terror against civilians by Menachem Begin's Irgun. At lunchtime on the 6th of October 1951, Sir Henry was cut down in a hail of gunfire when 38 communist terrorists ambushed his convoy. Extraordinarily, Sir Henry's assassins had been recruited, trained and armed by British soldiers who had taught them all the techniques of terrorism worth knowing.
British even teach us, train us how to use poison, to poison the enemy. Then when we fight them, they call us terrorists. So we fight his enemy, no problem. Whatever form we can use.
The enemy back then were the Japanese, and a desperate Britain had enlisted Chin Peng's communists as allies in the war for freedom. In 1945, Lord Mountbatten praised Chin Peng for his services against the Japanese, and later he even received an OBE. So how had he turned from trusted ally to hunted enemy? It's a classic tale of expectations raised and hope dashed. In 1942, off the east coast of Canada, the two foremost leaders of the free world had promised democracy and self-determination after an Allied victory to those peoples of the world who were suffering under Axis occupation. They called it the Atlantic Charter. But in 1945, with the war won, the grand phrases of the Charter were quietly forgotten.
Many of these peoples, frustrated by the inability to achieve their freedom, to achieve independence, to achieve the end of colonialism, in essence, through peaceful means, through negotiation, through asking, resolved that the only way that they would ever attain their freedom was through the use of armed force, was through violence, through revolution, and indeed, because of their numerical inferiority, through terrorism.
In Malaya, Chin Peng's communists attacked plantations, killed collaborators, and then famously Sir Henry Gurney was assassinated while travelling outside the capital. Gurney was in a convoy of 3 vehicles and was accompanied in his official Rolls-Royce by his wife, his driver, and his personal secretary, Dennis Staples.
The armoured car had broken down, and Sir Henry was a fairly exacting person. He didn't like foul-ups, quite frankly, and so he said, we'll leave the armoured car behind and go on.
We were trying to ambush a British convoy. You see, say 1 lorry or 2 lorries, a load of soldiers. That's coincidentally, Henry Gurney came. Before him, a naval commander, Far East Navy commander-in-chief. We didn't kill him because a very strong convoy, you see. When Gurney came in, we thought it was a very small convoy, not a very strong one, a weak one.
The driver was hit in the head and, of course, became unconscious pretty well straight away. And Dennis then wrestled with the wheel, couldn't hold it because the car's very heavy, and it started to veer towards the drop, the ravine on the left-hand side, and that was when he dived down and put his hand on the foot brake. And afterwards we discovered that the 3 bullets had gone through the back of his seat, and the others hit the dashboard and splattered over him. And he thought both the Gurneys were still in the back. And then they heard this bugle and the firing all stopped. And he called out to Lady Gurney, we can make a dash for it. And they did. And as they ran across the road, of course, they passed Sir Henry's body.
Why did Sir Henry leave the vehicle?
Well, it would be in character for him to think that they were after him, and that if he left the vehicle, they would stop firing at the others. That would be Sir Henry Gurney.
Chin Peng may never again have staged another spectacular like the assassination of Sir Henry Gurney. But his 12-year campaign of violence left nearly 2,000 soldiers and policemen and more than 3,000 civilians dead in the Malayan jungle. So do these deaths hang on his conscience?
If you say violence, who possessed the violence, the might of violence? The government. The whole Commonwealth was involved. So-called civilian casualties, we consider them as traitors because they become police informers. If they were informers, I think I don't feel any regret or sorry. Of course, in those periods, I can't say everyone we killed was correct.
At the height of the struggle, Chin Peng's communists tied up 350,000 British and Commonwealth servicemen. But the British actually defeated him by starving his men into submission. With the communist military threat contained, the British then negotiated Malayan independence with more moderate groups. So does Chin Peng agree that Malaya is an example of a successful counter-terror campaign?
In a sense, it is true, because we did not defeat them militarily. But politically, we defeated them. We forced them to grant independence.
In 1957, the sun set on Britain's Malayan Empire. After 9 years of war, the British had succeeded in orchestrating a peaceful transition to independence. Their success owed much to the foresight of Sir Henry Gurney, who, before he was assassinated, had always argued that the war against Chin Peng's communists was a war between colonialism and communism, and as a war of ideologies, it was far too important just to be left to the generals to fight. It was a lesson that should not have been ignored 6,500 miles away, in a colony where some of the most violent acts of terror were to be committed by both sides, as the colonial soldiers were given a free hand against the freedom fighters. Algeria, the jewel in the crown of France's colonies. A country France regarded as an integral part of the motherland. She certainly had no intention of giving up this prize, or abandoning the million European settlers who enjoyed the privileges of French citizenship, while Algerian Muslims were denied basic rights. Fed up with being second-class citizens, the Algerians, who had noted the success of the Zionist struggles against the British, decided to wage an equally publicity-conscious war of terror.
Ne figure pas dans notre vocabulaire.
The word terrorist didn't figure in our vocabulary because we were terrorizing no one. They were combatants. France did not want to recognize that it was a war, so they called us terrorists. But our situation was entirely different. Our fighters in the countryside and in the city, they couldn't wear a uniform, but they were soldiers without uniforms. So the word terrorism didn't exist in our vocabulary.
During the early years of the war, the fighting was restricted to rural areas. But in 1956, the Algerian independence movement, the FLN, decided on a major change of strategy.
I was one of the people who argued for the use of terrorism in the city. There were other ideas for the struggle, which didn't involve action in Algiers. Some of my comrades wanted to make it a haven of peace, after the model of Saigon in Indochina. That is to say, peace in the city and the struggle taking place in the countryside. I said no. A bomb or a pistol in the city is worth an ambush in the countryside.
From his baker's shop in the Arab quarter of Algiers, Youssef Saadi masterminded a cunning campaign of terror. From his point of view, this was the only answer to the violence and campaign of bombing against his people by the settlers.
La violence appelle la violence, et c'est ainsi que j'ai préparé.
Violence begets violence, and so I organized a workshop to manufacture bombs. Because I hadn't gone to university, I learned from a chemist who taught us how to make a bomb and how it worked. And as soon as we had this ability, that is to say, a weapon like those the settlers had, we used it against civilians.
A decade later, Sadi produced an Oscar-nominated feature film about his exploits in which he starred as himself. The film showed the simplicity and the efficacy of his campaign, nicknamed the Battle of Algiers. Yousef Sadi used young women in his organization, who could pass as French settlers, to carry bombs hidden in handbags under shopping or beach towels. Once the courier was successfully through the French checkpoints, they left their bomb in cafes and other crowded places. With an eye to the likely reaction on the world stage, the first bombs were timed to go off immediately before a key United Nations debate on Algeria. The bomb that exploded in a French cafe called the Milk Bar was placed by Zora Driff. Today, she is a successful lawyer and politician and has her office immediately opposite the site of her first mission. What ran through her mind that day nearly 50 years ago?
I knew the difficulties we had in making small bombs. You had to get hold of all these ingredients, and that was extremely difficult. You knew the effort it had cost to get this bomb. It had to succeed, and I had only one idea in my head. One had to get through the checkpoint, and it had to be a success. You're not frightened at that point. You're not frightened anymore. You're carrying out an action. You're trying to achieve an objective, and that's what counts. So I didn't any longer feel frightened or anything. That's it. You're possessed by the objective you're trying to achieve.
But what of the certainty of civilian casualties?
You know, we were young women at the time. We knew how cruel the things we were doing were, because we had suffered such things ourselves. What was important was to get a political reaction. Of course, I knew perfectly well that there would be civilian victims among the French. But I didn't feel responsible, because I was aware every day of the tortures, the massacres, the summary executions. Every day we had brothers and sisters, people killed. It was the law of war.
While most of Yousef Sadi's cell of bombers were European-looking Algerian girls like Zora Driff, there were a few French amongst them, women like Annie Steiner and Jacqueline Guérouge.
When I arrived in Algeria, I was shocked by the situation. There was no way I could remain passive in the face of it.
I don't know.
I saw the lives of the settlers and I saw the lives of the Algerians, and it was impossible not to take sides.
Who is a terrorist? In my own small experience of the subject, I saw that when you don't like some organization, a liberation movement or something like that, then they're terrorists. But when they correspond to your own interests, they are fighters. They are heroes.
The French government was in no doubt what it thought, and decided to call on its own secret weapon in the war against the FLN bombers. On the 7th of January 1957, General Jacques Massu marched into Algiers at the head of 6,000 men of the crack 10th Parachute Division. Massu was given carte blanche to smoke out the terrorists. For him, this meant only one thing: information. And if that meant torturing captives or even killing them to gain information, so be it. His right-hand man was Paul Osserès, later himself to become a highly decorated general.
Well, at the beginning of 1957, General Massu asked me to destroy this organization. And I repeat, to destroy, not to recognize it, or perhaps even to understand it, no, but to destroy it. That is to say, to kill those involved in it, to kill the participants.
It was a time when Algiers became a torture factory. You were sent to the technicians. It was a factory, a torture factory.
Nowhere was that more true than here, the Villa Souzini in Algiers, where the screams of the torture victims in the villa's windowless basement rooms went unheard.
I saw men entirely naked, with electrodes, an electrode on the tongue or on the earlobe, and another on the penis, another on the penis, and then the electricity.
They put you on a table, they wet you a bit with water, and then they connected you to the electricity, on the body, everywhere, from top to bottom. They put it on your ears, or on your nose, and sometimes they put it in your mouth. And sometimes they would put it there, and give you a burst. You jump, of course, with the voltage. Screamed and screamed and screamed. You have to talk. You have to talk. I don't know. I don't know. In certain cases, it was the only solution. In my own work, at least, in my own work. I do not say that it was necessary to generalize its use in Algeria, no. And I would say straight away that, personally, I only ever used torture when it was absolutely necessary.
On the 23rd of February 1957, the French arrested the most senior FLN commander ever captured, Labi Ben Mahidi. Ben Mahidi was one of the FLN's top 5 leaders, and after his arrest, his French captors proudly displayed him for the cameras before handing him over to Paul Osseres for interrogation.
They were thinking, if I do not use the fact that I have in my power a man who is implicated in organization of murders, well, more murders could be committed. So I will use every possible means to prevent more murders to be committed.
Osseres killed Ben Mahidi after 9 days of interrogation. His death was announced as suicide. So why did Osseres participate in this cover-up?
You know, I was too busy, to look at the bigger environment.
You executed him, didn't you?
Yes, yes.
Regrets?
Yes, yes.
Do you regret that?
Yes, yes, yes.
Pourquoi?
Because I was put in I was given an enormous responsibility,
La bataille d'Alger, c'était une grande victoire pour nous parce que
The Battle of Algiers was a great victory for us because it led to torture. It led to torture and it split the French government.
et le monde entier.
The whole world accused France of torturing people, so all eyes were turned on the French. So I think it was a great victory because we won the war.
L'arrestation du grand chef rebelle de la région d'Alger, Yassef Saadi, réputé insaisissable, est un...
In August 1957, after more than a year, nearly 300 bombs and thousands of deaths, the Battle of Algiers was effectively over when Yassef Saadi and Zora Drif were arrested, following information gained under torture from FLN detainees.
Son ami Zara Drif partage sa captivité.
But in spite of winning the battle, the French lost the war in Algeria. Their experience is a lesson to those who say the soldiers should be given a free hand and that terror should be met with terror.
The death roll, chiefly among the Muslim community, was reported as...
La première, c'est que la France...
In the first place, France prides itself on being the home of human rights, and by using methods that contravene human rights, we dishonor ourselves completely.
Même si l'adversaire les utilise.
Even if the adversary uses them, that is not a reason to do so.
Eh bien, c'est que l'efficacité de méthodes...
Secondly, the effectiveness of methods of torture, the corvée de bois and others, these aren't the right methods, the right ways to win a war. One only intensifies the hatred of the occupying country, and you end up reinforcing the rebellion.
Et on renforce la rébellion.
In 1962, after nearly a decade of torture and terror, the French government, now under General de Gaulle, decided to give the Algerians the independence they so craved. At just the moment, France finally and reluctantly cut loose its renegade North African colony. At the other end of Africa, the story of violence and counter-violence was just beginning. In South Africa, the success of the Algerian Revolution, the replacement of a white colonial government by majority rule, was an inspiration to the most celebrated terrorist of the 20th century, Nelson Mandela. The road that brought Mandela and the black majority to the ballot box in 1994 was travelled with guns and bombs, but only after the failure of peaceful means to effect change.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
Nelson Mandela, leader and founder of the sabotage movement Spirit of the Nation and leading member of African National Congress, was accused with the others of plotting sabotage to overthrow the South African government.
Mandela's ANC did indeed begin a campaign of limited violence in the early 1960s, which resulted in him spending the next 27 years in prison.
At the back entrance to the Pretoria court, large crowds gather to watch the accused being driven away to start their life sentences.
With Mandela breaking rocks in a prison quarry, all opposition was always met with brutal repression in South Africa. But by the 1980s, the country was in chaos. While the black townships burnt and South Africa buried its dead, the ANC's bombers hit a variety of strategic targets. One of their most successful commanders had a surprising background in a far-off land.
My great-grandfather was John McBride, who had come to South Africa to fight on the side of the Boers against the British forces here in South Africa. I would say our backgrounds are similar in that my background in my organization is an anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-oppressive background.
15 years after fighting for the Boers, Major John McBride was executed for his part in the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin. Famously, he refused to wear a blindfold as he faced the British firing squad. 70 years later, his great-grandson began his career as a bomber less than half a mile from his childhood home in the slums outside Durban, causing significant propaganda and economic damage to South Africa's apartheid regime.
When we hit the pipelines, the damage on it was the equivalent of 4 million pounds due to the crude oil being burnt, the damage to the canal, and the fact that there was an argument between the two oil refineries as to whose oil line had actually been hit. The fire burned for 3 days, and they had to fly in special fire extinguishing foam from Johannesburg to put out the fire.
South Africa was at war with its own people. To the regime, this was a life-or-death struggle against terrorism. So dissent must be stifled. The dissenters dealt with, and Mandela, the terrorist-in-chief in his prison cell, must be silenced and demonized until he and his organization gave up the use of violence.
The apartheid government was very smart in knowing that they would almost automatically get the support of the West if they condemned preemptively those who were opposing them as terrorists. They were quite firm in South Africa that each time you referred to incursions by the liberation movements, it was a terroristic activity.
As funeral followed funeral, the apartheid regime did everything in its power to portray the ANC's campaign as a race war fought between the forces of civilization and the forces of communist terror. And no one came to exemplify these dark forces more than Robert McBride. McBride had graduated from bombing oil refineries to more life-threatening activities. On the 3rd of May 1986, he killed a policeman as he staged the daring escape of a seriously wounded ANC commando from hospital. He loaded his comrade onto a hospital trolley, and with the drips still intact, the wounded man provided covering fire as they raced through the hospital corridor to the applause of black nurses. Then, on Saturday, June the 14th, 1986, McBride carried out his biggest and most controversial act of terror. Along with 2 members of the ANC, he contrived to place a bomb hidden in a stolen blue Ford Cortina next to a bar on the Durban seafront, which he believed was frequented by off-duty policemen and soldiers.
The operation took place around about 9:30, but we had moved into town already at about 8:30 or so. The car bomb had been prepared during the afternoon. Basically, a car bomb is the same thing as a missile, except your delivery mechanism is different. What we were doing was delivering a missile on wheels. We packed it into the boat. We preferred to use mechanical detonators. We had previously bad experience where electrical detonators were prematurely set off by electrical fields and stuff like that.
What does it feel like driving along the Durban beachfront with a primed car bomb?
It's, well, you're very nervous. You expect the thing to just go off any time. But you have to remain calm because suspicious behavior will draw attention to you, and try your best to look as calm as possible. But inside you, there's torment.
McBride's plan was problematic from the start. Whatever the legitimacy of targeting a bar frequented by off-duty security personnel, the pub in question was not only on a busy road with passing vehicles and pedestrians, but was also right next door to another bar, Magoo's, which was filled with students.
The first thing I remember was deadly silence straight afterwards. Like there was no noise at all, and there was you know that smell of, like an acid smell. That's the thing I remember, was a smell. And then when it kind of like came to, there was a lot of screaming. I don't think anyone knew what had happened. I was there with a girl, a young girl, and we both jumped out the window and we ran away, and probably half a block away, she sat down on the grass. She wouldn't open her eyes. She refused to open them because she just didn't want to see what was going on. And then I turned around and went back. When I arrived there, Roger, which is my brother, was trying to pick up Angelique, but he couldn't because a piece of glass had cut right through his shoulder here. So he couldn't pick his arm up. So I picked her up, and I immediately knew she was dead because, you know, she was just limp.
Angelique Pattenden was 22. The bomb also killed 28-year-old Marcel Gerard and Julie van der Linde, who just happened to be driving by at the time and whose car took the full force of the blast. 70 others were injured.
The next morning I was quite devastated in the sense that I was not aware of the enormity of what we had caused whilst we were carrying out the operation. But I was shocked the next day. In a sense, there was a feeling of almost disbelief, it's almost denial. The rationale I used was that even though it is often said that killing per se is immoral, that sometimes not using violence when it's needed is immoral itself, when you allow your people to continue to be slaughtered. That if you continue using peaceful means or non-violent means, or you're actually being in a greater state of denial, and that in itself is immoral.
McBride and his two comrades were caught 4 weeks later, and he was sentenced to death. After 6 years on death row, McBride was eventually freed as part of the negotiations that led to South Africa's peaceful transition to majority rule, as Nelson Mandela always insisted that McBride was a prisoner of war, not a criminal.
If I helped to change South Africa, if my sacrifice for that is to be called a terrorist, then I'm glad to have been a terrorist for liberation. And I think I'm amongst very esteemed people to be called a terrorist.
History has already determined that Mandela and McBride are seen as the victors in their fight for freedom. But what of those involved in one of the longest-running struggles of them all? That place is Ireland. And since 1969, 1,121 soldiers and policemen have lost their lives. 1,838 civilians have been killed. And the cost in terms of property destroyed runs to the thousands of millions. It's a war that has also featured one of the most dramatic acts of terror against the British establishment since Guy Fawkes. In the early hours of the morning of the 12th of October, 1984, a bomb planted in the bathroom of room 629 of the Grand Hotel in Brighton came within inches of killing Margaret Thatcher and any number of her cabinet, together with a host of senior Conservative politicians. They survived, but 5 others died in the explosion, and 34 more were injured. The man who placed that bomb was Patrick Magee, and like South Africa's Robert McBride, his politics were also the product of his environment.
I was living in an area called Unity Flats, so it was a real flashpoint area. And if you lived in that district in the early 70s, it would have been the most natural thing in the world to join the Republican movement and become part of the struggle. I first had to convince myself I was up to the task. I didn't think I had it in me to do those things. I wasn't a violent person. In fact, I would have considered myself at one point a pacifist. I was very drawn to, the Martin Luther King line, etc. When you see what was happening on the ground there, you couldn't just stand by and do nothing.
When Ireland was split in two in 1919, Catholic nationalists became a permanent minority in the north. And by the early 1970s, Republicans, like Magee, believed the ballot box had failed them, and they turned to terror to achieve their aims of equal rights for Catholics and a united Ireland. After being involved for nearly a decade in the IRA's bombing campaign, Magee placed the device for which he will always be known simply as the Brighton bomber.
Thought it was necessary then, and now I would still see it as necessary, unfortunately necessary. But I've met victims of the Brighton operation. I've sat down and talked with them. I've met their families, etc. And it stirs up a lot of feelings. So although I can stand over that operation as I can stand over the armed struggle in general, I'm more aware of the effect it had on the people. That people were hurt. And I look at it like this. Before it was a faceless enemy. You've seen the uniform or you're seeing the political allegiances, etc. But not until you actually see, the hurt you've caused to people, when you see them as individuals, do you really get a perspective on it. And so that's what I have to grapple with. I have to grapple with the fact that I've hurt people, which I do regret. But I still maintain that the armed struggle was necessary, and those operations were necessary, the operations I was involved in.
McGee was sentenced to 8 life terms for Brighton, but in 1999 he was released for good as part of the Irish peace process. By then, the IRA and its political wing, Sinn Féin, were embedded in that process. Although there is still no united Ireland, for the IRA it would appear that terror has now served its purpose.
When you view the recourse to armed struggle as a symptom of your own weakness, and in the sense that you don't have the political means to further your objectives, then it follows that when you do gain, those means, then you have to, leave the armed struggle aside or move on. It's never as simple as, one day armed struggle, the next day politics, because the development of politics, the base, etc., organizational development, all that can take a long, long time, particularly when your political enemies are doing their damnedest to undermine your political development.
It's too early to say if the Irish process will indeed bring permanent peace. But like other such movements, the IRA has found that terror alone never achieves political objectives, and that the time always comes when negotiation and the political process takes over from the gun and the bomb. Thereafter, the road from reviled terrorist to revered statesman can be rapidly travelled. (1994), and Nelson Mandela, by now an iconic figure of international peace, travelled to Oslo to receive his Nobel Peace Prize. 16 years previously, another former wanted terrorist, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, also became a Nobel laureate. But for one family in Israel, the debate about whether Begin was a terrorist or a freedom fighter had an especial resonance. One of the Jewish victims of the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1946 was 35-year-old Zvi Shimshi. He left behind a young, pregnant widow and a 4-month-old daughter, and a family disagreement.
My father, absolutely, I think he was a victim of terrorism and of an unjust terrorism. Terrorism which killed civilians and citizens and street walkers, and not only government officials. And I think I'm very much against it. I think that terrorism is not a solution for anything, not an answer for anything, not here in Israel and not anywhere else in the world.
I don't think they were terrorists. I don't. I think they were national fighters, really. That's my feeling till today, and even at the time it happened.
Menachem Begin and his Zionist compatriots, whether freedom fighters or terrorists, invented the modern age of terror. Today, the state created in the wake of their actions is itself subjected to almost unimaginable terror from those who also claim it as their homeland, and who, in some cases at least, want to eliminate all Jews from the face of the earth. Both sides seem unable to recognize one of the fundamental lessons of the use of terror in the name of liberation.
You will never really get true security and peace from the barrel of a gun. Ultimately, it's going to be when people sit down and acknowledge that the other has as much right to existence as themselves. What is happening in the Middle East, a working out of an inexorable law, that violence will evoke further violence. You call it whatever you want to call it. It's a spiral that is going to go on until someone has the sense to say, hey, we can't go this way forever.